I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight for a discussion about the impact of COVID-19 on immigrant, migrants, and essential workers. This webinar is brought to you by Rochester Regional Coalition Against Human Trafficking. We are dedicated to eradicating human trafficking in our communities through education, advocacy, and networking with individuals. I encourage you to visit our website, rrcaht.org, for more information. Some of our 2019 highlights include us having our second annual fundraiser, us having a roundtable discussion on legislation to decriminalize prostitution. We have also educated over 1,000 individuals, and we received the grant from the Greater Rochester Health Foundation to put on our first human trafficking and social justice conference. But of course, COVID-19 had a mind of its own. This webinar is being recorded and will be available after the presentation. We will have a Q&A session after the presenter speaks. So please put your questions in the Q&A section. We will do our best to get to them. So now I would like to introduce our speaker, Mr. Jeremy McLean. He's a native of Wyoming. Jeremy McLean has extensive international experience, having lived and studied in Mexico, Panama, Peru, Japan, and Israel. He has been actively involved in promoting low-wage workers' rights since 2011. As a staff attorney and outreach worker at the Workers' Justice Center of New York, and as a worker organizer with Rural Migrant Ministries. Jeremy has advocated for many clients, focusing on agriculture and other low-wage workers. Through legal representation, rights education, and efforts to train other advocates, he has assisted clients in obtaining immigration remedies available to trafficking and other crime victims in pursuing civil redress for those who have been trafficked or otherwise exploited. Jeremy graduated from Syracuse College of Law in May 2013 after completing graduate programs at the University in Oklahoma. He obtained a master's degree in international studies at Oklahoma State University. In Mexico, he obtained an international MBA from the Universidad Popular Autónoma de Estado de Puebla. He also completed a master's degree in natural resource management while enrolled at Syracuse. Prior to his post-grad education, Jeremy studied Spanish and biology at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona. So on behalf of the Rochester Regional Coalition Against Human Trafficking, I want to welcome Jeremy for his presentation today. Thank you.
Julia, sorry for that bio, that was a little long. It's a pleasure to be here and talk with you all again. I feel like I have talked with most of you when I lived in Rochester, worked at the Workers' Justice Center of New York. Now I'm in Brooklyn and do federal and international policy on trafficking and guest work. So I've been trying to pay attention in the last few months, in particular on how the current health crisis has affected some of the populations that I worry about, and have developed a short presentation. I'm going to try to get through it as quick as possible because I'd really like to have a discussion and really know what you all think about some of these issues. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, so hopefully everybody can see the title we've talked about. And just to start, I'm going to run through some of the important markers since the pandemic started in this country and how the current health crisis has kind of been weaponized to target immigrants, migrants, and other workers from abroad by the current administration. So obviously in February, it was declared a public health emergency. About a month later, the Trump administration declared a national emergency because of COVID. Very, very soon after that, 5 days after, suspended refugee admissions into the country. If you look at refugee applications into the United States, the vast majority right now, as I'm sure you all heard in the news, come from Mexico and Central America, where there really at the time and still comparatively was not a lot of risk as far as refugees from those countries bringing in the coronavirus. So it's curious that almost immediately after it's recognized as an emergency that refugees specifically were targeted for non-admissions, that they won't even be considered under asylum law. On that same day, on the 18th, visa processing was canceled, first in Mexico and then throughout the region. That really slowed down some of the guest workers that were scheduled to come and work in the fields, in landscaping, in seafood processing, a lot of the J1s that come and do temporary seasonal work in hospitality businesses. So that stuff happened pretty quickly. From there, there were the first stay home orders. A month later, immigration whole scale was suspended, not for health reasons, but to protect jobs, protect the US economy. At the same time, however, there were new rules put in place that enabled specific guest workers to stay in the country if they were already here, so that that low wage kind of manual labor type visa would still have its place in the US economy. We could talk about those specific rules if you're interested afterwards. Shortly after that, we started to see how some of these populations specifically were affected by the virus. There was a lot of meat packing first that reported huge outbreaks, and they had to close down some of those plants because they did very little to protect their workers who are working elbow to elbow in pretty unsafe and often unsanitary conditions anyways. But a lot of those types of businesses had huge problems with coronavirus outbreaks among their populations. Similarly, it's not the same populations, but just to point out that when we talk about essential workers, and we'll get into that later into the presentation, these same workers that were deemed critical to the economy were also placed at high risk because of their work conditions, and virtually no changes were made to accommodate the CDC recommendations for social distancing, for hygiene, for hand washing, for face masks. And finally, a lot of people just got upset. And, you can see here that Amazon specifically, they basically went on strike for a day. Later, it was a bunch of retail employees who called in sick to protest that they were not given the protection and the conditions that they felt they needed to protect themselves from this disease. Around the same time, on the 26th of April, Tyson Foods says that the meat supply chain is going to collapse because all of our workers are getting sick. Some of these same type of workers begin to actually die, and we started to see a little bit more attention focused on working conditions in a pandemic. Again, in Los Angeles, there were over 100 workers who were tested positive for the virus, but they were asked to continue to work and deemed critical, that we needed our hamburgers, our sausages, etc., even though there were huge outbreaks. Later in June, the suspension of immigration of guest work got very specific. H-2A workers were excluded. Again, they were deemed critical to the food supply in this country. But H-2B workers, by and large, were not allowed to enter the country. There were exceptions made for H-2B workers that could ostensibly be deemed participatory in the food supply chain, but J1s, H1Bs, and L1s were whole scale not allowed to enter into the country after June 22nd, and that ban essentially is supposed to be in effect until the end of the calendar year. So I bring this up to point out this contrast and honestly hypocrisy when we talk about essential workers and their importance. Just to get into definitions, if you look at the DHS, essential workers are those who conduct a range of operations that are essential or critical to infrastructure and operations. That's pretty vague and broad, but if you go to certain government websites, they designated these sectors or industries as critical. Agriculture is one that's very relevant to our discussion. Critical retail. Basically, these are all kind of entry-level, low-skill, low-wage jobs. So just to point out here as well, farm workers in this pandemic have been deemed essential, very important to the economy and to the food supply. But what do farm workers earn? Not a lot. I'm sure you all know this. I believe that we've talked about this before, and I know that you've talked with the Worker Justice Center and their work with agricultural workers. But to be a farm worker, to work in agriculture is not a lucrative occupation. We're talking about wages that are barely above, the median wages are barely above poverty level for a family of three. And oftentimes, if you do get above the poverty level as a farm worker, it's because you have other income or other jobs that you're doing on the side. These are not high-paying jobs. Just as a point of comparison, childcare was also deemed an essential service and was permitted to continue at all times during the pandemic. What do they make? The wages are very similar. These are not jobs that people go into to become wealthy, but they are deemed as critical, important, essential in these times of global health emergency. And one of the points that came up is a lot of times for these types of positions, we're talking about low wage work that is often forgotten, unappreciated in normal times. Now we're asking these workers to continue to go to work, to not stay at home when everybody else is told to stay at home for their own health and safety. Are we going to do anything extra for these critical workers as they go to work and not only do very hard, backbreaking work, but literally put their lives at risk because they are going to work? There's a lot of arguments out there. This is just one article that I found by Kamala Harris that argues that grocery store workers, a very small, portion of essential workers, deserve hazard pay because they are exposing themselves to this health risk every day by going to work and continuing to provide us with our necessities during this pandemic. There were other measures during this time, even though the current administration deemed farm workers, H-2A workers in particular, essential and permitted them to enter the country and work. They also took up efforts to lower their pay, not to offer them hazard pay, not to improve conditions so that they could feel like they were being protected and safe at work from this invisible virus, but they attempted to lower their already low wages during the pandemic. So the hypocrisy here is they're essential, but what does that mean? We need them. We cannot function as a society without them, but we're apparently not willing to provide them, one, with hazard pay, which they should get, in my opinion, or two, with the basic protections and rules that would protect them at work from this very dangerous health scare that we're all living through right now. So how does this tie into the general topic that this coalition focuses on, trafficking? We've all seen this definition. What is trafficking? It's force, fraud, and coercion to obtain the labor or services of someone without their express permission. There's all kinds of versions or brands, I guess, of trafficking. Sex and labor are the two big categories. But how does this relate to this pandemic and workers that are affected? When we hear, especially the federal government, talk about trafficking, they always say that they have this paradigm of the 3 Ps: prosecution, protection, and prevention. If you talk to anybody in the federal government about trafficking, their main and principal focus is on prosecution. But what about protection? And in particular, in this discussion, what about prevention? What are we doing to prevent people from being trafficked, exploited, abused, so that we don't necessarily have to rescue them and prosecute their traffickers after they've already entered into very dire and extreme conditions? This is just another example of when you're talking about prosecution, this is what the U.S. Attorney, this is what investigators for DHS, the FBI, local police are focusing on to prove a trafficking crime. And this is the focus of the government. And I think I bring it up and repeat it because it becomes part of the problem when conditions are even worse than normal, because the government does not focus on trafficking in a preventative light. They are always focusing on the crime. How do I prove it? How do I discover it? How do I put bad guys in jail? That's very important. It needs to happen. But it would be better from an advocate's perspective to help people to avoid a trafficking situation in the first place, so that we're not always looking at trying to prove that there was a process, a means, and an end of trafficking, but that we've avoided vulnerable people from entering into situations where they would be abused and exploited in the first place. Just as an example, and I'm sure that I've talked with most of you about this specific case, this is the first case that I handled when I started at the Worker Justice Center when it was still Pharmacal Legal Services of New York. In 2010, this case happened down the road from Rochester at the New York State Fairgrounds in Syracuse, where H-2B guest workers were trafficked by a Greek food vendor from Queens who had them in horrible, horrible conditions. You can see some of these points of their mistreatment. It was awful. The only reason that these workers were actually discovered and provided assistance is because at the state fair, several of them, because of lack of food, rest, and water, became so sick that they left their food stand to seek medical care, and the medical care called someone for help because he could not believe that these people were still walking about and working under these conditions. How does this happen? These workers came from Mexico with a work visa. They were known to the US government. They were known where they were going to be, and the terms and conditions of their employment was specified before they ever entered the country. So how does this kind of craziness happen when everybody knows who they are, where they are, what they're doing? So this is what I hope is kind of the tie-in between regular discussions of trafficking and extreme conditions of a global pandemic. This is from a publication by the UN that basically says, besides looking always at like, how do we prove trafficking when it happens, take a step back and how does trafficking happen in the first place? Vulnerability is the key. Traffickers focus in on marginalized groups, try to pinpoint their weaknesses, their needs, so that they can exploit them. This last sentence is particularly germane to our current conditions in pointing out that extraneous factors outside of a trafficking scheme can really heighten vulnerabilities and provide opportunities for traffickers to abuse vulnerable people. And that is certainly true right now in conditions of a pandemic that we'll talk about here. So in general, when we're talking about this type of worker, I wanted to kind of focus on temporary foreign workers or guest workers. These are workers who come in upstate New York. The most common ones will be H-2A and H-2B workers. Seasonal agricultural and seasonal non-ag workers. Could be landscapers, forestry workers, etc. These points of data show that if you look at kind of the universe, the known universe of trafficking after it occurs, a significant portion of that trafficking happens to guest workers every year. Of all the civil suits filed in the past almost 20 years, almost half of them involve guest workers. In a 2-year span, Polaris, who operates the National Human Trafficking Hotline, they have almost a third of their callers who call in and have trafficking or trafficking-like situations are guest workers. A 2014 study of labor trafficking victims cited that almost 3/4 of their sample were here in the US on temporary visas. So this is a population that for some reason has vulnerabilities that traffickers can identify and exploit. What are those weaknesses in the temporary foreign work programs? Normally, I'd love to hear from the audience what you guys think about this, but I'll just run through this and we can talk about it in the question and answers. From my perspective as an advocate who focuses on guest work, these are some of the inherent weaknesses in the programs and why they tend towards abuse, exploitation, and trafficking. Workers are tied to one employer. If they leave that employer, they are immediately out of status and are at risk of deportation. It's a hidden workforce. I think most people, if we're just talking about our region in upstate New York, have no idea how many people come to pick apples, to cut lawns, to do other crops, ground crops, right outside of Rochester every year. I know that you all know that, but I think the general population does not know who these people are, when they come, what they're doing, and why they're here. So it's very hard for them to break out of that isolation and find any kind of assistance. A real insidious problem from my perspective is that ultimately the employers can shirk their responsibility for the conditions of their workers. You have recruiters, you have crew leaders, you have all these basically subcontractors or layers of employment that ultimately keep the farm owner, the ultimate employer, the person who really is receiving the benefit of the work, out of responsibility in the government's eyes. And that's a real problem. And fourth, you have recruitment costs, fees that are collected illegally because you cannot charge fees in H-2B programs at all. It's a little different for some of the other guest worker programs. You cannot charge fees for a job or to get on a list for a job or a potential for a job. You cannot do it. Here, you cannot do it. You cannot do it in the countries of recruitment. But every single worker, not every single worker, majority, I would say, of the workers that we talk to report that they paid somebody to get a job in the H-2 programs in the United States. And that really compounds some of these vulnerabilities because the reason that they want to leave Mexico or Central America and come to the United States is because they are in economic turmoil. They want to find better jobs to provide for their family. Once they have to pay hundreds and very oftentimes thousands of dollars to get that job, or sometimes for even the chance to get a job, even if they don't get it ultimately, that really compounds this economic pressure for them to do risky things to try to lift their family out of poverty. From these recruitment fees, we see a lot of debt bondage situations, or we see kind of mafia-led loan sharking where workers put up with so much as far as bad conditions, bad treatments, wage theft, because they need that money to pay off that mobster so that their family and they will not be harmed physically because they didn't pay down this debt that they had to take on to pay these recruitment costs. Just quickly to give a couple examples of this first point, this statement here is something that we often heard when talking to workers, that the message that they would receive. Quick anecdote, I apologize. When I took some depositions for the state fair case, some of the defense attorneys repeatedly with every single worker, asked questions like, did you see anybody in chains? Did you see anybody tied up in a burlap sack? Did you see anyone that was thrown in the trunk of a car? That kind of physical bondage happens, certainly does, but trafficking today is not like the movie Taken. It's psychological, financial, legal coercion. Legal in the sense that traffickers abuse the legal system to leverage points of weakness to get people to put up with conditions that they normally would not. And this is a great example of that. It's like, I'm not keeping you here. I am not locking you up, but if you leave, you'll be deported. And if you're deported, you'll never be able to come back to the US legally again. And that kind of pressure is so powerful to keep people doing things that they wouldn't normally do for wages that they didn't accept in conditions where they wouldn't normally choose to live. These are actual quotes from a couple of cases. This pickle case was one of the very first trafficking prosecutions when the law, the trafficking TVPRA, Trafficking Victim Protection Act, came into effect in 2000. This memo was sent out to all the employees. We cannot stop you from leaving. We do not condone it. You are violating the conditions of your visa, and you will be without status here in the United States. And not just deportation, but subject for prosecution. And this is the kind of pressure, abuse of the legal system that traffickers use to keep people in horrible conditions. A quote from someone who went through these conditions: I could have left, but I didn't want to because I didn't want to be out of status. I didn't want to be at risk for deportation. So much trafficking happens. Where can we find points of focus? I put this slide up just for everybody to get kind of an idea of how many guest workers come to this country every year. It's almost 1.5 million, and this is almost 10 years old. So I'll show you in a minute. These programs are exploding. There are efforts to make H-2A work year round. In 2013, 74,000 H-2A workers came, but you can look at this graph, and just in the past few years, the total numbers of H-2A workers are now almost 250,000. That program in particular is exploding. And that's more and more vulnerable workers that come to this country under normal conditions, that because of their immigration status, the way that the visas are set up, because of illegal recruitment fees, because of economic need in their own countries, are very prone to be abused, exploited, and trafficked. How is that compounded by a health scare crisis like we're experiencing right now? This map just shows some of the tracking that people have done specifically for farm workers. And basically, the green dots are where you've had explosions of cases specifically involving farm workers. The other gradients here, red spots, are just hot spots for COVID generally, and it goes down as you go from red to yellow to gray. But it just points out that these places are often, like some of our counties in upstate New York, very remote, very isolated. So not only do you have workers who, because of their isolation, might not know where to turn for help, but they now might not know where to turn for medical assistance. And that creates a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth vulnerability for them and their families, where if they get sick, they lose their job. So they don't say they're sick. Everybody else gets sick. You can all look up farm worker outbreaks of COVID, and there have been outbreaks in a lot of these kind of migrant labor camp style housing in Washington, in Jersey, in our state of New York, in California, in Florida. And it's just another point of vulnerability where someone has a greater need now because they're sick And that's a point where a trafficker or an unscrupulous employer can abuse them and really pressure them to, again, put up with conditions that they under normal circumstances would not. There's another report that just recently came out for H-2B workers in, I believe, Louisiana, who were processing crawfish, who started to exhibit symptoms of the coronavirus and just went to the doctor, just went to the clinic. Once their employer found out that they went to the doctor, they were fired. And that's the kind of disconnect between these workers are essential, they're important, they're critical, but we do not care about their health and safety, their work conditions. We just want them to work and be quiet. Another article that points out that kind of disparity where a farm worker explicitly has said, I'm an essential worker, but really what I am is underpaid and I'm at risk. And that dissonance is really disturbing. It should be disturbing for everybody. Kind of the last point before we go into questions is generally when we're talking about trafficking and we want to do something as far as prevention to avoid people having to enter into these situations, I like to think of all of these things as a spectrum of abuse. We often want to think that there's a bright line, and on one side is trafficking, and on the other side are things that are immoral, are unethical, maybe illegal, but they're not trafficking. And we focus on what is on the other side of that legal line that is trafficking. As an attorney who represented clients in trafficking cases, civil cases, and who has assisted in some of the criminal investigations for trafficking, that bright line is not very clear. It depends so much on circumstantial evidence, on the prosecutor, on the workers and how afraid they are to be completely honest. It's really hard for attorneys, for the government, for anybody to say definitively that this is trafficking and this is not. From my perspective, what we need to do is start looking at all of these types of abuses of workers. We're just talking about labor trafficking, and not focus so much on just what is beyond that line that we've created legally that says this is trafficking. What about all the wage theft? What about the discrimination? What about these pressure points? What about the vulnerabilities? And for us to really make a difference and try to change the system so that people aren't abused and trafficked, we need to focus much more on these vulnerabilities and all of these things that are always involved in a trafficking case, but sometimes don't amount to trafficking in the eyes of a prosecutor or an attorney. We don't care about those things enough. And for us to really make a difference here, we need to look at this whole spectrum of abuse and exploitation and do something about it. And until we do that, we really will be ineffective in preventing any kind of trafficking. And we'll have to focus, just like the government does, on punishment after the fact when people's lives have been ruined. And that's not good enough. Right now, during this pandemic, it's really kind of crystallized that workers do not have the kind of support publicly from their employers, from the government, to demand that they, at the very bare minimum, deserve a safe place to work. And until we can see this whole spectrum and start to do things about this, pandemics and other kind of international crises will just sharpen that knife of trafficking. And we need to think on a more holistic scale about these systems and how workers are exploited generally. And that is where I will stop, but I really, I'm looking forward to, in kind of the back and forth with everybody on the call to see what you think about this.
That was great. So we want to thank you, Jeremy, for that informative and timely presentation. We really appreciate it. So we do have just a few questions. One question said, are foreign-based recruiters connecting directly with employers in the US, or is there another party involved?
Yes and no. There are so many recruitment schemes out there that it's hard to say like this is the model. Generally, what would happen is an employer says, I want to get foreign workers to come. Let's say it's an apple orchard, near Rochester. And you have to solicit with the Department of Labor and get approved that no U.S. workers can fill those jobs or want to fill those jobs, and you get permission from the DOL. Once that permission is given, then you start working with the Department of State to send a recruiter down to a specific country and recruit those workers. From that point, it's really tough to really, in each case, draw a straight line from the owner of the apple orchard in Rochester to the worker who's hearing the pitch in rural Mexico. Oftentimes, you may have one recruiter who acts as the crew leader during the season and goes to Mexico to recruit from his or her locality, people that they know. And that's a little bit easier to kind of establish where these lines of responsibility lay. But in other cases, you have companies who just kind of contact random recruiting agencies in the United States or in the country where they're looking for workers. And then it's hard to pinpoint if they are doing the recruitment themselves, if they're contracting with somebody else in the country of origin. You'll have recruiting schemes where you have one guy who is receiving the money for recruitment from the farmer, and then he is paying a quota to numerous other people below him for each person that they bring in. So it's a tough kind of system to suss out the details, and that's part of the problem. Is there's no rules on how these recruitment systems are set up, and employers always will say that it wasn't me, I didn't do it, I didn't know about it. And if we could tie this responsibility always to the ultimate employer, then they would be a lot more vested in establishing these lines of recruitment and making sure that they're honest and fair and legal.
Awesome, thank you. So the next question is employer threat of deportation, does it meet the standard of coercion or force?
Yes, any threat of the abuse of the legal system can be a form of coercion. I know that we've talked about it, and I'm sure you've all heard, like coercion, again, is not always some kind of physical threat, being locked up and chained. It's very psychological. And deportation is one of the biggest problems, one of the biggest threats that people have. And it's that second part too. When we're talking specifically about guest workers, if they abscond from their work, they are deportable. But once you're deported as having abandoned your job, then you are being deported as a person without status who is in the country without permission at that point. And you can be barred from 3 to 5 to 10 years, depending on the mood of the judge at the time or your history of immigration before that. And if you're depending on these jobs every year, that risk, not just I'll be deported this year, maybe you don't care, like I want to get out of here, you're a jerk. But it's that risk of being denied the opportunity to come back in subsequent years that really carries a lot of force for these people because they depend on these jobs to provide for their family.
And that continues that cycle of abuse and vulnerability. So, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it creates this cycle of need that then even if they don't come in a guest worker program, maybe now they're so desperate that they, are smuggled across the border by some coyote, and now they have a huge debt. I mean, the last people that I've talked to, and it's been a few years, but the price, I want to say 2 years ago for crossing the border from Mexico was $8,000 to $12,000. If you're leaving your home because there are no jobs, there's no way you have $8,000 to $12,000 in the bank. So you are taking out loans with some very bad people who, if you do not pay them, will do horrible things to you and your family. So then you're creating this whole other vulnerability system where people are desperate and will be abused because of that desperation.
Mm-hmm. And that 8 to 12,000 is US dollars.
Yes.
Okay, so next question. The spectrum of abuse is excellent. What are the 3 best ways to move the blue further to the right?
So one of the things that I always think about is wage theft. It doesn't have to amount to human trafficking, but wage theft is rampant in all of these programs, in farm work generally, because employers know, or sometimes it's not the employer, sometimes it's a crew leader, but whoever is in charge of paying the people will skim, will take a percentage, or not give them their last paycheck, etc. That is a huge problem because of these same vulnerabilities, whether you're an undocumented farm worker or a guest worker. If you don't get the money that you have worked for, that you were promised, the answer is always going to be, if you don't like it, leave, but I'll have you deported, or, well, I'll call the cops. If you're undocumented, I mean, that's the first response, If we cared more about wage theft generally, I think that would go a long way to alleviate that kind of first step of exploitation. Maybe before that is some of the bad treatment that workers receive. I'll try to share, there's been a few articles very recently that talk about trafficking in Georgia, in potatoes in Texas, and there's a wage theft article that came out a few years ago that talked about how much wages, even in claims that were made and won, either through the Department of Labor, state or federal, or through civil lawsuits, that are just never paid. So even if you complain, win, and have a judgment against somebody for wages that you already earned, the chances of you recovering any of that money are 25%.
Mm-hmm.
And that cannot be. We cannot ignore wage theft in a trafficking spectrum of abuse if we really care about workers. That's the first thing. Others, obviously the big answer is that this is impossible. Like, how can we do this? But we have to eliminate these vulnerabilities from the source. If people weren't desperate to leave their home country and do anything for any kind of chance for a better life, then traffickers wouldn't have these points of entry. So how do we solve world poverty? I don't know, but that's the real answer, right? Another article that just came out recently talked about Guatemala specifically in climate-related immigration. There are other large-scale factors that, again, just hurt and damage impoverished people more than anyone else and create more vulnerabilities so that people will need to flee their countries under any system, way, or circumstance because they cannot survive where they're at.
Mm-hmm. And I think you bring up a valid point when you're talking about, the daunting task of trying to curb and, eliminate world poverty when Rochester has the 3rd highest poverty. So that also increases risk, right here in our, backyards for trafficking.
It really does. I mean, I'm sure you guys have all heard about the sex trafficking problems in Rochester. And quickly, I know this is not our topic here, but that stems from poverty, from drug abuse, from desperation within our own communities that we can't even address. Like, how are we going to address poverty in Guatemala and climate change when we can't even fix, our local poverty issues? But that's really what it is. If we can eliminate some of these vulnerabilities, we can keep people from entering into these dangerous situations.
All right, awesome. Let me give you another question here has this administration reduced regulations on employers to make it less risky to exploit guest workers?
Yes, we are expecting a new set of rules from the Trump administration on H-2A any day now. The expected date was the 1st of this month. But just a few of the things that might be in those rules, at least in the proposed rules were there. Who knows what the final rules will say. But for example, they want to allow employers to self-certify the housing conditions for H-2A workers before they come. I don't think I have to tell you all, it's not universal, but generally, housing conditions for guest workers out in the middle of nowhere in Wayne County, for example, there are plenty of examples of no one would want to live there. And that is already with, a requirement that the health department come in and certify that housing is acceptable under the conditions of the H-2A program for people to live there. They want to change it so that employers can just attest that those conditions are being filled. They're not even being filled now with inspections. So small changes like that will just save employers money and again, put workers at greater risk. So now, if you have a complaint, if you are unhappy with your wages, you can be threatened with worse housing. Or if you get sick because, another thing about housing generally, it's related, is you're in barracks. How are you going to social distance under the CDC recommendations for working and living if you have 6 bunk beds in a 20 by 20 room? Anybody gets sick in there and everybody will be exposed. And those are just suggestions. Those are not requirements. So now the administration is trying to allow farmers to self-certify. And I guarantee that even the very few and insufficient requirements that are there for housing will not be followed. And that's just one example of how they're trying to change these programs that will hurt workers, helps employers, and will create additional vulnerabilities where people can be abused and exploited.
Thank you, Susan. So it says you have information regarding workers who enter legally. What about all those who enter illegally and cannot be identified or followed because workers already live in fear of deportation? Any idea of the number who enter illegally?
I mean, this is very similar to like the question, how many people are trafficked every year? No one knows. Generally, there are guesses about the undocumented population in the United States being anywhere from 10 to 18 million. But again, that's a huge range. This has been years ago, but, and I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but the estimate by Cornell several years ago of the total migrant farm worker population that comes through the state of New York was something like 60,000 a year. But that would include, documented, undocumented, and guest workers. But still, if you look at the total farm worker population in the United States, the percentage of H-2A workers in that total population is less than 10%. So we still have a huge number of just farm workers who are most likely undocumented, and again, have that additional layer of vulnerability that traffickers will identify and will exploit to keep them in conditions that could amount to trafficking.
Okay. So next question is, what can people in the U.S. do to educate voters on what is happening to migrant workers and those stuck in camps at the border, trapped in the policies of MPP, remain in Mexico, the weaponizing of COVID against migrants and asylum seekers is getting worse?
I mean, there's so many things to point out about this current administration and how they are directly, deliberately targeting people from outside the United States. How do we do that? It's so hard. Look, I mean, in my bio, I'm from Wyoming, the most Republican state in the country. And I was just there working remotely for about a month. And what I tried to do is find, you know, points of empathy, perhaps. I mean, in Wyoming, the main industries are agricultural and natural resources. So you can talk about farm work, about physical labor, and people will understand a little bit. The nice thing about trafficking, compared to all these other things, remain in Mexico, asylum, etc., is for the most part, no one is in favor of trafficking. Again, trafficking is just part of the discussion for me. When we're talking about this spectrum, we need to care about the whole spectrum, not just trafficking. But trafficking is very useful as a discussion point, as a point of entry, so that you can get people of different political views to at least listen and buy into your discussion. So, and it's sad to have to sensationalize it if you know, to talk about the worst cases all the time, right? To talk about the trafficking cases versus someone who worked for 4 months and was only paid 2. Like, everybody should be opposed to that. But we don't care. Trafficking is a way to talk about these things and have people care, have people engage. For some of these other issues, it's really hard. You know, there's so many people in our country who just think that immigrants are the problem. And it's, you know, I think to me and probably to most of you, it's ridiculous, but I don't know how to open those kind of discussions and have people realize that it's not the other, you know, it's the 1%. It's the people who are controlling the systems, who own the farms, who own Amazon. They're the ones that are really creating the conditions that, you know, expose us all to these vulnerabilities. But it is a very tough discussion when we're talking about all these other factors that affect immigrants.
So one of the things that I heard you say is that, you know, it's this 1% that create these conditions. But I guess it also begs the question of, you know, what role do we as Americans in our complicity and our convenience play into that?
It's a great point. Like, the power, the wealth is very skewed towards, you know, whatever that percentage is at the top. But we still live in a democracy in a capitalist country. If there was a critical mass of consumers, of voters who decided that they had had enough, we really could change these systems. It's not an easy thing to do. And there's so much apathy. There's so much, I think, cynicism that it can't change. It's been this way forever. What can I do? Any one of us as an individual or even as a group probably can't do much. But if we were able to convince enough people to create that critical mass, whether it's, you know, by not buying from Amazon because they won't protect their workers from COVID, or betting where our apples come from in upstate New York and only buying from those farms that are really invested in the recruitment schemes of the H-2A workers, if they use them, who are paying full wages, who have decent housing. That takes a lot of work, and it's hard. It's hard to, you know, figure out who is doing it right. But if we could do that, if we cared enough, then we really do collectively have the power to change these things. But it's a huge lift.
Mm-hmm. So the next question is, how do you make exploited workers aware of your services?
Right now, since what I do is focus on trying to change policy for the most part on a federal level, my outreach to workers is to try to find those stories that will convince politicians or constituents to engage and try to change those systems. Otherwise, generally, when we're talking about services that are available to exploited workers, it's a lot of legwork. You know, the Worker Justice Center of New York, where I used to work, and I know that you guys have quite a bit, it's outreach. all season long to visit every camp that you can and talk to every worker that you can. That's, even then, it's really tough. You know, as another quick anecdote, I remember visiting a worker population from Michoacan. They were indigenous, they were very tight knit. They had been cheated out of some part of their legal wages for years. And a lot of them, when we went and did outreach one particular season and told them what they were actually owed from that year and all these, you know, previous years, a lot of them were very, very upset, but they wanted to talk about it. We came back a few weeks later and no one was willing to do anything. And what we think occurred is they were such a kind of a tight-knit, and there was a real respect for leadership. So there was, you know, one or two guys that kind of spoke for the group. And it was more important to them and their community to be able to come back every season, even at a reduced wage from what was legal, than to cause problems and risk being blacklisted or not able to come back, or that the recruiter would go to an entirely new population, not just exclude a portion of their group, but the whole group. Mm-hmm. And because of that need and their dependence on this system every year, they were not willing to demand that their legal wages be paid. And I mean, it's very frustrating from an advocate's perspective, but you have to respect that. I mean, you have to respect that those people have needs and they are doing their very best to provide for their families and their communities, and it's up to them. And beyond outreach and just trying to get material out there, it's hard, and we don't do enough because there are so many workers who don't know what their rights are and don't know where to turn once they find out that their rights have been violated.
Right. So one of the things I heard you mention earlier was we talked a lot about the wage and the wage theft and how we should really care about that. So in thinking about that, just really looking at the advocacy work we do, and, you know, is there a role for us to do something more on the aftercare side in terms of that wage theft, in terms of really bringing more awareness to that? And I definitely think that's something that we need to have a conversation about as a coalition to kind of get to the heart of that matter. Plug for Heidi, heart of the matter. So yeah, I mean, so kind of talk a little bit more about, I mean, because like you said, this is a very daunting task. And, you know, oftentimes there's a lot of, you know, people that are committed and want to do the work and want to advocate. But it's, like you said, it's so much heavy lifting. Like, what are some things that we can do tomorrow? Are there specific legislation talking points? What can we do to kind of get the ball rolling in that direction from our coalition standpoint?
Yeah, I think, you know, as far as policy to fix systems, I think heavier penalties for wage theft, making business owners or boards personally liable for unpaid wages. What often happens is you sue an entity, and by the time you win the suit, they've either paid so much in attorney's fees or they see the writing on the wall and they just dissolve. And there's no assets, there's no way for a worker to recover money legally owed. Mm-hmm. And again, our system has, deliberately or not, been set up to enable the people at the top to avoid these responsibilities. You know, there's all these arguments about what is a business? Is it a person? Does it have constitutional rights? There's always a person behind those businesses. And if they were made ultimately responsible for the conduct of the business, then they would be a lot more careful in following the laws. And there's so many business interests and lobbying interests against that type of liability. But if that were enforced, if that were possible, that would be one way for us to change the system where you could go after individuals because of the conduct of their business. The other thing is, you know, if you have a history of this type of abuse, it should be harder for you to recruit, if you're a recruiter in the guest worker program, to get a business license in the future. If you're a restaurant who doesn't pay, who's stealing tips from your waiters, you shouldn't be able to open another restaurant very easily down the road.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the way that our system is skewed. We want new businesses, we want economic development. So we turned a blind eye to this bad history. And that's ultimately what it comes down to, is there are no repercussions for acting in this way. There needs to be penalties, there needs to be punishment, economic punishment for economic theft. And that's something that I think, again, if we had a critical mass, we could possibly change and make some improvements so that A, workers who are stolen from get their wages they've already worked for, and B, that it dissuades bad conduct by employers in the future, because there are real penalties.
As you were talking and I was thinking about that, putting on my research hat, if there could be probably an app, like how is that data collected once you have, kind of gone through this information or these lawsuits or taken these depositions and found out about all these quote unquote bad employers?
Mm-hmm.
How is that information stored? I have to wonder if there could be like an app where we can get to that information and know about these different organizations. Is there any kind of data collection port or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's all public records. There's a way to get at it, but it's not easy to access, and it's very hard to organize. Another problem, when you're talking about just transparency and information, to even have a data set, is very often you'll have the state go after, not in a civil suit, but the actual, government of the state, or sometimes the federal government, for unpaid wages, and they will settle with an employer. But the employer is going to settle admitting no guilt and having nothing on their record as having not paid wages. And again, that creates an out for employers. The state fair case that I mentioned earlier, the state of New York originally did some of the unpaid wage investigations, and they ended up settling with the employer, who basically was able to say, I just made a mistake on payroll, and ignored all of the trafficking claims, the misconduct, the bad health. I mean, these guys were living in bedbug infested trailers, dehydration, they weren't being fed. It was horrible. It wasn't just the wage theft. But the state, once they settled on the wage theft, just dipped out and didn't care anymore. And I mean, that lack of accountability for employers is really detrimental to the system. It discourages workers from speaking out in the first place, and it enables bad actors to continue operating shady businesses forever, because they just change the name and have a new board, and there's no repercussions. It would be great for a group like our coalition here to think about some of these things and do social media campaigns to not patronize certain businesses. Yeah, I was going to mention the case in Rochester, but I better not. There are plenty of businesses, restaurants, farms that have these histories and have all the customers in the world, because we don't pay enough attention and we just don't care enough.
Mm-hmm. I have a few more questions here. Has the Biden campaign made any comments on guest worker policy?
My organization with some others, we're trying to create some, help for the Biden administration, should they win, to do some immigration reform generally, but also specifically for guest worker programs. The information that they put out so far is pretty vague on what their priorities would be for guest work. But we've been told that they are very amenable to kind of not only repairing the damage done in the past 4 years, but being proactive and progressive as far as promoting new reform that would protect workers, immigrants, refugees, etc. So we're hopeful. but it's so hard to get anything done in Washington right now.
Mhm.
One of the main things that I work on is just a transparency bill for guest workers, that the government would, in a uniform manner, just release the information about guest workers, who they are, where they're working, what the terms and conditions of their employment. And there's so much resistance from business interests. They don't want the exposure. They don't want to be scrutinized at all, whether
Mhm.
they're acting illegally, unethically, or not. They just don't want people to know that they're using these programs. And when you can't even get past that kind of a hurdle to get data, to not even change programs, to not even put more onus on employers just to know what is going on, it's hard to get to that next step.
Mhm. So like you mentioned in this, that's also one of the issues even here when you think about sex trafficking, that, our organizations want there to be more job details to hold people accountable. So on that other end, it's like you want to hold those businesses accountable. There needs to be more detailing and more investigation into that. But like you said, there's a reason that that's not happening. So
Yeah.
we have to think about one more question.
Okay.
Do you think COVID-19 has brought more of these situations to light, and maybe action would be taken? I am thinking of the case of the workers in central New York who were working, I think, at a hydroponic plant and got the virus, and the employers were forced to give better conditions to workers by the state. I think that's it.
Yeah, no, I do think that this provides a moment for us to talk about some of these issues. You know, I think agriculture workers in particular could really right now stand up and say, we are important and we deserve decent work conditions, we deserve a decent wage, etc. Again, I was talking with some colleagues in Mexico who work with the populations before they leave Mexico to come to the United States. And we were talking about this, like, if this would be a great moment for a strike, I mean, if essential workers, especially in April and May, stood up and said, we're not doing this until these concerns are addressed, that would have been such a powerful, powerful thing. Unfortunately, the precarity of those workers, their economic needs don't enable them to, do that kind of an action. They need the money and they need it now. They have paid these fees. They need to pay down their debts. A loan shark is not going to wait for a strike for a month. It's so hard. I do think that, generally it's created a little bit more awareness about the vulnerability of certain workers and, again, how they are important. If they're so essential, we should take better care of them. But in the end, will anything change? Will it make a difference? Hopefully, but I think we'll have to see.
So what would success look like if things were changed? Or
Yeah, I mean, I'll just talk about guesswork. What would success look like? There's still not like a clear, easy answer, right? Like there are things that need to be tried. Unfortunately, that's part of the thing too, is there are proposals out there like this perhaps would be better, but it needs to be put into practice. And it's hard to have the political patience to change systems and see if they work for all the actors. For example, one change that would, I think, immediately make conditions better for guest workers, let's just talk about H-2As, is that they get a visa and then they can move between employers who have been approved for H-2A workers however they like. The biggest problem is once you sign up as an H-2A worker, you must work for John Brown the farmer until the end of your contract. You cannot go to another farm, no matter how bad the conditions are, no matter what. If you leave John Brown's farm, you're out of status, you are deportable. If workers had that power, again, to really, have a free market of labor, they would have a lot more power to say, we're not putting up with this. Like, your conditions are horrible. You're not paying us legal wage. We are leaving. We're going down the road. They cannot do that. That would be one very small fix that would potentially make a world of difference and just empower workers to make their own decisions and put the onus on employers to compete for good conditions. Compete by giving good conditions to workers.
That's great. Because like with everything, and I don't really want to talk politics, but with everything going on right now with even, you know, the COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, this is the same way that you're starting to see a lot of the disproportional kind of injustices. And, you know, just thinking about this, there's those underlying injustices that have been, you know, that these policies that's in place, you know, continue to affect the very vulnerable, you know. So we see that, we're seeing that all the way across, but like you said, it's just a matter of, do we care enough? Who's paying attention? And like you said, they're even more vulnerable because they can't have a voice, because if they go back home, then they're at risk. If they stay here, they're at risk. So where do they belong, and who's going to be the voice for them?
It's a great point. You know, these are not new problems, but something needs to change so that we can fix these decades-old problems.
So I don't see any more questions. So I want to, on behalf of the Rochester Regional Coalition, I want to thank you for being here. This has been very timely, informative presentation. You know, I met you 4 years ago and was just amazed at the wealth of knowledge that you have and continue to build on. And we appreciate you taking out your time to be here with us. And we're hoping that we can do more of this in the future. So I just wanted to remind the audience that the webinar is brought to you by the Rochester Regional Coalition Against Human Trafficking. We are dedicated to eradicating human trafficking in our communities through education, advocacy, and networking of individuals. And I encourage you to visit our website, rrcaht.org, for more information. Did you have any final words?
Thank you very much. I always enjoy speaking to this group. And I do think that this group and groups like it can be very powerful on a local level to change things and make Rochester a safe place for workers, not just workers, everybody. That's very important, and I really appreciate the work that you all do.
Thank you. And from our audience, we're hearing great talk. So we want to thank you one more time.
My pleasure.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
So I wish everyone a good night. Oh, hold on. One more thing. Great talk. Thank you. This was excellent.
Okay. I am going to end the meeting. So thank you all for attending. And thank you, Celia, for moderating, and Jeremy for your wonderful, informative presentation. It was a great first start to our webinars.
Thank you.
Thank you.